and your RSV vaccine if you're over 65 and your flu vaccine, you now can get the COVID test again at covidtest.gov.
Oh, that's good
So,
news.
yeah,
So
4 free tests per household.
I've just been informed that you weren't on air. People was listening to heavy breathing from a producer. Like,
okay, I don't know what that means. Are we on air now?
We're on. Can everybody hear Dr. Mel now? Give a thumbs.
Okay. Yes. All right. Fantastic.
Everybody in the audience. Okay. Put it in the comments.
All right. Well, good. Well, I don't know at what point, but as always, I welcome y'all and let y'all know that we're here to make sure that you have all the health information that you can use to make wise health decisions. And of course, ask you to remember to like us on Facebook, hit the subscribe on YouTube, and let y'all know that covidtest.gov is the place to go for your 4 free COVID tests.
She said,
"Oh, y'all don't really miss anything."
Right. I mean, they meant hey from me, and then they miss COVID tests from you. And and what you always say, welcome.
That's right.
Cool. Fantastic. So I'm glad everybody can hear. I'm excited. Y'all look amazing. I'm looking around.
Yeah, but we have somebody
and Dr. Mel. Wow.
We have somebody missing though.
Yeah, somebody's missing tonight.
Yeah, because this is our Howard University Research Centers and Minority Institution Community Engagement Corps joint show. And we do this once a month. Partner with Howard University, and Howard University's representative with us is Karen Parker, who is the project coordinator in the Community Engagement Corps at RCMI. And so welcome, Karen. Thanks for joining us again this month.
Thank you for having me. Good evening, Be Health Empowered team. Hi, missed you all. Love doing this. Happy almost October, everybody. Can I talk a little bit about why I'm here and what I do?
Yeah, absolutely. Take it away.
Okay. Just in case people don't already know, because people tune in to watch this every month when we do this. So interesting thing about the Community Engagement Corps, which is what I'm a part of, is we are a research arm. Research Centers for Minority Institutions is the program that I work with at Howard University. And what our job in the CEC arm is to do is make sure that our community that we work directly in contact with through conversations like these is tapped into what we're doing on the research side, and consequently that our researchers have the opportunity to share what it is we're doing on the Howard side. So to keep those dialogues open and do a lot of listening so that we make sure that what our neighbors hold in priority is what we're reflecting in our research. So happy to be here as part of this conversation.
And that is a wonderful mission. And part of being health empowered is knowing about research and where the research opportunities are that you and your loved ones might become involved in. So we value our partnership with Howard University, and they often, in these shows, help us also choose the topics. And so tonight, we have a really powerful topic that we're going to introduce. And I'm going to kick it off by just asking a simple but powerful question. What happens behind closed doors when nobody is watching? In the homes of countless families across the country, there's a silent epidemic that's been happening, but it's hidden in plain sight. We don't talk about it a lot, but the reality is that domestic abuse, which is our topic tonight, affects millions of people every day. It doesn't matter your age, your gender, your background. I know myself as an emergency physician, I saw my fair share of men and women who had experienced domestic abuse. And so before we really get into the subject tonight, I just want to let everybody know that this is a very serious topic. There might be people who are listening who've witnessed or experienced domestic abuse. I just want to sort of put up an alert and a warning that the discussion might be triggering, but if you choose to stay around for it, it will be a very rich and enlightening discussion.
Indeed. And I'm going to jump in there and say that we're all wearing purple in honor of DV month, which starts tomorrow, right? Yeah. So tonight we're breaking the silence. We're opening up this conversation about heartbreaking realities that too many people endured in their own homes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really timely concerning what's in the news. And lately, a gentleman was arrested and is being held currently, who we saw a whole tape of him, you know, dragging his partner, his girlfriend, down a hall and kicking her, and that's on tape. And you know, we could say that without mentioning the 1,000 bottles of baby oil, right? We could say people get hung up on the funny stuff, but what's not so funny is women who were affected, women and men who were affected by this person who's, you know, you can read it in the headlines. You'll know who he is. Right.
Well, we're talking about somebody who we might as well, you know, it rhymes with Fiddler, right? Who's been
the diddler?
I'm not gonna say the name, but rhymes with
mean,
Fiddler.
We didn't say the name. Kind of sounds like.
And was arrested for sex trafficking, racketeering, and accused of domestically assaulting a woman partner. And I think that's really interesting because so often that's exactly where we go, is to the physicality of DV. But is this the only type of domestic violence? I think our expert gets to really break down what DV, and I'm going to say DV. I don't want to further trigger anyone, but our expert gets to talk to us about what it means in totality.
Yes, I agree with you. And she is going to talk about that. And there's so much more to unpack. And thank you for that, Lila. I think I'll use that as well. DV does it destroys individual lives, and it rips through families and communities, and especially in marginalized groups where there's less access to resources. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be talking tonight about how to recognize it, how as a community we can stand up against it and support those who really need the help. So really, it's not just a problem that's individual, it's everyone's responsibility.
Yeah. So of course we ask that as you're listening, we want you to be a part of it. Put your questions in the chat. Lila and Wayne are going to come back and join us later, bring and surface all your comments and concerns that you put there. And we're going to just go ahead and dive in by welcoming our wonderful, very knowledgeable expert, Francesca Dalla Betta. She is the training and outreach coordinator at the Washington, D.C. Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Thank you so much for joining us, Francesca.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
There we go.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mel and Karen, for bringing me in tonight. I so appreciate getting the opportunity to speak with you all and speak to all of your listeners. As you all were getting at, this is such an important topic to discuss. And one of the biggest challenges with domestic violence is it's in the home, it's hidden, and there's so much stigma in talking about it. That's so valuable when people like you who have connections in the community bring up these conversations. And I always like to say, start the conversation, because an hour isn't enough to get through it all, but to really start these conversations and what we can do as a community to address domestic violence. So thank you so much for having me here.
And I'm glad you brought that up about starting the conversation, because this is actually going to be a two-part conversation. We're going to continue this next month. So we're glad that you are our expert to kick it off. And I think we should start off by, kind of setting the table around terms, like words that people hear, so that we can all understand the discussion. So we've heard the term domestic violence, DV, as Lila was referring to it, as well as the term intimate partner violence. Can you talk to us about what these mean, how they differ, how they're the same, what the overlap is?
Yeah, that is a great question to kick us off, because definitions are the foundation for our shared understanding. So at the Coalition, we use the word domestic violence. Domestic violence is an umbrella term that includes things like intimate partner violence. And so the definition of domestic violence, when we say this, it's a pattern of coercive and abusive behaviors used by one individual to exert or maintain power and control over another individual in a dating, formally dating, family relationship. So in that definition, there's a couple of pieces that are important, but getting at, those different words we use, it's also often called dating violence or spousal violence, spousal abuse. But the reason we use domestic violence is to get at everyone who can experience it, like you were mentioning, Karen. Because when, sometimes we hear that word spousal abuse, what comes to mind might be an image of a heterosexual relationship with a man as an abuser and a woman as a survivor. And we want to break down those barriers and really emphasize that anyone can experience domestic violence. It can be with a partner, it can be with a family member or a caregiver, with someone you're living with. So there's a lot of different people who can be really affected by this. So that term domestic violence is that umbrella. It gets at it's violence in that home, it's domestic, it's behind closed doors, and it really is about that power and control, which it will be a theme, I think, through what we talk about tonight.
Yeah, no, thanks for breaking that down, and also for highlighting that it can be anyone who is the perpetrator and anyone who is the victim. It doesn't go by gender lines or age, certainly. And then what does the term abuse mean in the context of a relationship?
Yeah, so that gets at that power and control piece is the really key part of our definition of domestic violence. We often think that abuse is exclusively physical, and that's often the only abuse that we can see. It's one of the only forms of abuse that might show up on someone's body or be visible. But power and control is at its essence what domestic violence is. So there's an imbalance in a relationship where that survivor doesn't have power and control, but that abuser does. And so when we talk about abuse and different types of abuse are the ways that an abuser exerts their power and control, keeps that survivor from gaining power and control in their life, from gaining that independence. So abuse might be physical, but it can also be emotional. It can be spiritual abuse or housing abuse. It could be language abuse. So it's these different ways that an abuser is exerting that power and control and keeping that survivor from gaining independence, gaining support, getting out of that isolation.
Got it.
Thank you. Thank you for really breaking that term open for us. Can you tell us, Francesca, how prevalent or widespread this is in our country?
Yes. So the statistics, there's so many out there. And when it comes to intimate partner violence, the statistics are that in the US, 41% of women and 26% of men experience intimate partner violence. So that's a huge amount of people. Like you said, Dr. Mel, it's millions of Americans experiencing that. And we know it's experienced by people across the globe. But one really important caveat with this statistic and any statistic we use is, for the most part, these are reports of domestic violence. So that's really key. These are not numbers of people who are actually experiencing it, but those who report. And so when we think about the stigmas that anyone faces when coming forward and gaining access to support, and then we think about additional stigmas that certain groups face, likely all of the statistics we're seeing are underreports, and even more so potentially for certain groups like men or trans survivors or groups who have been historically discriminated against and don't have as much access to those resources. But we know it's so many people who are experiencing this. And like you both said, it's often not visible, which is often not talked about.
Sort of like a tip of the iceberg phenomena.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
So do these rates differ depending on the community that we're talking about? I know that
Yes.
you already started to bring that up, but I wanted to kind of zero in
Delve
on,
a little deeper.
yeah.
Yeah. So this is a really important piece when we have these conversations. We
Mhm.
always want to emphasize that anyone can be a survivor of domestic violence. And that's no matter how much privilege you have, no matter how much money you have. But also, we know that for many groups, there are much higher rates of domestic violence. So that we know that for people in LGBTQ plus relationships, they experience violence at similar or higher rates. We know that trans survivors experience it at much higher rates. We know that Black women here in DC experience it at much higher rates. So there's many different groups that experience domestic violence at higher rates. And I want to highlight 2 reasons to get us thinking about why that happens. The first being why someone might be extra vulnerable, and the second being those barriers to resources. So we know that if someone is part of a marginalized community that historically has been discriminated against, that can make them more vulnerable, because going back to that power and control dynamic, that abuser can kind of attack that vulnerability and, isolate someone further. It could be, I'll out you to your family if you don't stay with me, or no one will believe you because you're blank. So it can be
And
this
I
aspect.
don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to
Yeah.
highlight that isolation piece, because I think that's
Yes.
really key as a tool that's used that further, isolating people keeps them away from being able to report and people understanding what's actually going on with them. So sorry to interrupt. Please keep
No,
going.
that's a really important one to highlight, because that is so common in so many relationships. And thinking about the theme that we're getting at too of, how to identify, how to talk about in our communities, that isolation piece is really important. So we have that first part of, why someone might be vulnerable, but additionally, it might be a barrier to gain access to services. So we know that a lot of different groups, when they try to get housing support or speak to a domestic violence advocate or call law enforcement, will face discrimination in those moments that can lead someone not to gain access to services, to have a harder time gaining that support, that independence, and getting out or getting support with what they need.
Yeah, that reminds me of a study of Black women who were seeking, who made reports to the police about the domestic violence that they were experiencing. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be disregarded or even abused by the police officer in the context of seeking help. So that's to your point, that the abuser knows what groups,
Exactly.
if the person that they're dealing with, if they're already marginalized, and then it'll be that much harder for them to get help to address the
Right.
situation.
Yeah.
So, we talked a little bit about, sort of the high profile case that's going on right now with a public figure, and how that really kind of highlights and deepens the association of domestic violence with physical abuse. You started to elaborate on the different kinds of abuse. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because people listening might be really experiencing domestic abuse and not even realize it because they think of it as purely physical.
Yeah, that is such an important piece to this. I think so often we can kind of vilify one type of violence and disregard so many other forms of abuse that are so hugely impactful. So something we really emphasize in the domestic violence field and in this work is there's no hierarchy of violence. There's no one form of violence that is worse. Each survivor is experiencing their own experience, and it is powerful and challenging no matter what. So we have physical violence, which is the one that shows up in the media, the one that shows up in movies, and can be hugely impactful and highly dangerous. So we know physical violence is a form of abuse, but there's also a whole slew of other types of abuse. So I'll make a flag that we use a tool called the power and control wheel to have these conversations, which you can look up afterwards on your own. There's specific ones for different groups, but it's a wheel that has spokes of different types of abuse. So I already mentioned a couple. Isolation is on there, like you pointed out, Dr. Mel. There's emotional abuse, minimizing, denying, and blaming. So some of the things that when you hear the word gaslighting, or you think of someone, an abuser, blaming the violence and blaming the harm on a survivor, someone maybe threatening them with looks or signs that no one else understands. Could also be abuse via children. It could be the abuser using children as a tool to control that survivor, telling lies or threatening to call CFSA and get your children taken away. So those are a couple of examples. There's different ways that language and your immigration status might play into it. But one other one I want to highlight, and I can dive deeper into any ones, but one specifically talking about Black women and Black people experiencing this is one called collectivism, where it's this form of abuse where the abuser will say, well, you shouldn't report me because that'll look bad on our community, or try to pull in, whether it's your racial identity or your faith community or your ethnicity. That abuser can use that and say, well, you shouldn't report this, or it's really not that bad. We don't want to talk about, this in our community and make our community look bad. So there's so many different layers to the ways that abuse can happen. And that's just a few examples.
Right. Or the fear, I think, sometimes of Black women not wanting to expose other Black people to the criminal justice system, period, because of the fear that, we don't want our men to end up in the criminal justice system. So they rather be the victim than have that happen. And I think that speaks to that collectivism piece that you just mentioned.
Yeah. And one thing that makes me think of as well, I've worked a lot with immigrant survivors, and when an abuser doesn't have a legal status, that can also be a really big barrier, where survivors will say, hey, I want this violence to stop. I want to live my life free of this relationship, but I don't want that abuser to be deported and potentially harmed. I don't want my children's parents to, encounter this. So there's a lot of layers there, whether it's, the criminal justice system or someone's immigration status, where even the abuser's identity and how they may face discrimination can really influence how a survivor feels comfortable going forward, what services they want to gain access to.
This is a very rich conversation. It's got so many tentacles, right? This awful thing. Could you tell us a little bit about, you were talking about the work that you do with these various groups. What does your organization do? I'm referring to the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And how do you leverage your role within the organization?
Yeah. So I know listeners are some in the DC, concentrated around here, but around the nation. So I work at the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, but there are coalitions in all states. They are sometimes a combination of domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions, but you can look it up. You will have your own coalition. And we are a collection of service providers who provide support to domestic violence survivors. So here in DC, we have 18 member programs who provide things like legal services, case management, culturally specific service providers, all these different forms of support. And so our role at the coalition is to simultaneously support those member programs, train them on ethics and domestic violence 101, on trauma-informed care, to support them in their work, as well as to work to advocate across the DC area. So we have a policy arm that works on gaining funding for survivor-centered programs and really making sure survivors are thought of in, anything that's going through in DC. And then we have our training arm, which is where I am with my colleague Liz. And our goal is to do things like this, talk to the community, really destigmatize domestic violence and educate on what it is. So we train service providers, we train government officials, we train community members, and just really work for this grassroots and communal emphasis against domestic violence.
Thank you for the work that you do. It's essential. Could you tell us a little bit more about what a service provider might be? Is it,
Yes.
because I heard you name a number of different groups. So is a service provider like a clinician or a social worker or
What are
a
the
labor
services that
community?
people need?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an abundance of service providers. And so you mentioned a clinician. And so if you think about what someone might need when they're experiencing domestic violence, that is a whole range of things. It goes from safety planning. So how do you stay safe while you're in that relationship, or if you want to leave, to legal services, from, getting a civil protective order, which is like a restraining order, gaining support with child custody or your immigration case. So there's service providers that do that, mental health and counseling, legal services. There's also crisis. So phone lines and chat lines that you can call if you're in a crisis in that moment. You're like, I really need support. We also have housing service providers. So one of the biggest needs across the nation for survivors of violence, whether it's domestic violence or sexual assault, is housing. And we know in DC, housing is really challenging. There's
Most
some
major
barriers
cities.
here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so that overlap of people experiencing homelessness and experiencing domestic violence, there's a lot of people who are seeking support. So when we talk about housing, it could be crisis. So I really need a place now, to, support with rent and more long-term stability options. So those are a couple. And then the last one that I'll mention now, trying to make sure I'm getting a holistic picture, is we have a lot of culturally specific service providers. So we have certain organizations who work with people of different communities. We've got here in DC, AYUDA, who works with low-income migrants. We've got Deaf Dawn, who works with deaf and hard of hearing survivors. We've got the Person Center, who works with African immigrants. There's a number that work specifically with certain populations. And so that can be really helpful if a survivor says, I'm really nervous to come forward or gain support because I don't know who that person sitting across from me, how they're going to respond. They might not know my experience. And so some of those providers can be really helpful for certain survivors who say, hey, I want to talk with someone who's going to really get what I'm going through. So those are another really great resource that exists here in DC, but also across the nation.
Yeah.
Are these resources free of charge?
Trust is essential.
What was that?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Are
Yes.
these resources free of charge?
Yes. So these services, again, there's a whole range and there's different eligibility sometimes for different programs, but they are free, confidential services. So one of the really important pieces to that I think can get misconstrued is sometimes people might think, okay, if I call this number or if I go in to get support, I'm going to have to blank. I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to have to get a civil protective order. But the really important piece is we train advocates on this, domestic violence advocates, or who works at these organizations. You can just come and ask questions. You can gather information. You can say, hey, I really want to do something. And we're all trained to be survivor-centered, which is this understanding that the survivor, the person, is the expert in their own experience. So we're here to support. We're here to, we have all this knowledge and power because we've been in this work. So we're here to give you that power, give you that knowledge, help you make informed choices, but never are we going to tell you what choice to make. And I think that's so key in those services because it's going to take, different times and understanding and learning for someone to know what's best for them. So we trust that the survivor knows what's best and we help, get them connected to those resources that are gonna help them make those informed, safe, healthy decisions.
I really love that because when you say survivor-centered, there's this, tendency to look at somebody else's situation and judge them and say, well, why don't they just leave? Or why don't they just, or if I was in that situation, this is what I would do. What are some of the common misconceptions about people who are survivors and the judgments that people project on them?
Yeah, that I'm so glad you brought up that question that we always hear, that why don't they just leave? And
Right.
that's such a loaded question, and is also understandable, because if you haven't experienced it yourself and you're watching from the outside, it can be really easy to make assumptions. So we try to roll that back, and there's a couple pieces that come to mind with that. One thing we know about domestic violence is it's often a slow escalation over time. So we talk about this spiral of violence where most often people wouldn't get in relationships if on the very first date or the very first day you moved in with someone, they were emotionally abusive or physically harmed you. But what happens with domestic violence is there's often this escalation over time, where it might start off as something that seems healthy or normal, and over time it builds to this crisis, this incidence of violence, and then often has that calm after, where that abuser might apologize and say, oh, that won't happen again. So if we think about someone who's in that spiral and is experiencing that over and over, it makes a lot more sense why it can be hard to break out of it. There's often, real love that can happen in a relationship that is abusive. Just because a relationship is unhealthy or abusive doesn't mean there aren't positives. Survivors can often rely on abusers, whether it's for, financial means, or supporting their children, or gaining access to
Housing,
their community, or housing.
a place to live, which is why the
Right.
correlation between domestic violence survivors and the need for housing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's all these elements why someone might feel really tied to an abuser and not feel ready to go. And then we think about safety and stigma and resources. And we know that one of the most dangerous times in an abusive relationship is actually after it ends. So when someone is trying to leave, that can be a really high lethality time. It's called separation assault, where an abuser can retaliate. Because when we think about that power and control, it's that
Yeah.
survivor gaining access to more power and control by saying, I'm done, I'm going to leave. That abuser can often try to re-exert that power and control in really dangerous ways. So those are some of the things that, I encourage you to have in mind when you're thinking about something and you feel the urge to say, well, why don't they just leave? There's so much context going on behind the scenes that you're not privy to that can really inform why someone stays or why someone is experiencing that and going through that.
Can I just jump in here for a moment? Because when you talk about the different ways that it looks for different people, and I'm thinking back on the definition that you gave. I mean, I work at an institution of higher learning. So can this not also happen with students who share living situations?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering, because they're not necessarily in a romantic relationship, but they're clearly in some type of, they have to build bonds. What
Right.
does it look like in these different types of situations? Like, it could look one way in a romantic relationship, like you were talking about that spiral, I think you called it. What might it look like amongst people who share a suite or who are roommates?
Yeah. And I like that you brought up that definition again, because you notice in the definition of domestic violence, there's no word romantic or sexual or inherently a partnership that is a romantic partnership. It includes a lot of others. So you brought up roommates and people who share a housing situation. That can totally be a place where domestic violence happens. It might also be between someone who's disabled and their caregiver, or someone's mother-in-law who maybe lives in their home and is exerting that power and control and that emotional abuse. So it can look like a lot of the same things. It can look like that isolation that we've brought up, or that minimizing, denying, and blaming and emotional abuse, where that abuser is putting someone down and continuously trying to strip them of their power and control, isolate them from their friends, maybe gaslight them in that way. So there's different ways that it can show up, but it's not exclusively in a romantic relationship that it can happen.
So, if people want to reach out and get resources, what are safe ways, what are safe ways to reach out? What are some of the concerns that people need to have, especially if they might have children? For example, how can they make contact and still maintain their safety?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And I will say it's getting even harder with the more technology that we have these days, because tech abuse and knowing who has access to your devices is a really important conversation when it comes to safely accessing resources. But for starters, getting connected to a domestic violence advocate is one of the first steps that can be really helpful here. So domestic violence advocates are those who work at domestic violence organizations. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because of what we call safety planning. So whether it's for you as an individual or you with your children or your pet, safety planning is the planning that goes on that an advocate can walk you through of how do I stay safe? When I'm in this home or when I'm ready to leave, how do I stay safe? So that is a conversation that's really beneficial to have with someone who can think about those elements you might not think about, like keeping your documents all together in one place, and having a go bag, or identifying the signs when violence might be escalating. But for that initial contact that you're asking about, you can call one of the hotlines is a really good way to do this. Sometimes we recommend people save hotlines in their phone under a different name, so that if an abuser gains access to your phone, they're not going to see domestic violence hotline or, the DC victims hotline. They might just see a call to a friend or a pizza place, and that can help protect you from potential retaliation. So it might be calling. A lot of those hotlines now have chat options, so you can chat in, whether that's through text or on a computer, and just getting information about resources that way. If you're not comfortable showing up to an organization in person, getting that connection through the phone call, whether through the hotline or, looking on our website and saying, hey, this is what I need, let me call that organization. And getting that initial contact can be really helpful to then develop those safety plans for, as you move forward.
Is there a national hotline phone number or access
Yes.
point?
Yes. So the National Domestic Violence has a hotline. I have the number somewhere around me. But if you look that up online, it will come right up. And that one has a phone line and a chat line that you can access through your computer, through your phone. And one of the really great things about all these websites that we have now is they do have quick safety exits. So if you are looking up something on the website, whether it's the National Domestic Violence Hotline or, say the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they'll have those buttons in the corner that you can safety exit, which don't erase it from your search history, but erase it from your screen. So if someone were to walk up and look over your shoulder, you can get rid of that. But things like going to a public library, borrowing a friend's phone can also be really good ideas if you have a trusted place or a trusted person.
Well, it is that time to bring our audience back in, or bring our audience in and bring Lila and Wayne back on screen so they can tell us what's going on in the chat and get your comments and questions in here from the Be Health Empowered audience.
There's so much great information and so many terms that I haven't heard before, like housing abuse, separation abuse. Like those are things that are so important, but it's all in the cycle of manipulation and power, right? So interesting. I'm trying to grab this hotline number, Wayne, to drop it in the chat. But if you have some questions, I'll come back with a couple of questions. We can't hear you, sir.
Well, I will pull up some of the messages that we have in our chat. I look at this message for Gina B. Prince, and she says, this affects migrant communities in large numbers. So often they're afraid to speak to the police and any other authority figure.
Absolutely.
And we have one from earlier from Reese Parker. I'm a mental health professional. In my experience, I've found many abused women leave an abusive partner only to get in a relationship with another violent partner. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so that can happen if someone is looking to get out of an abusive relationship and they're looking to move on. Often you're in a really vulnerable place because, like we talked about, maybe you've just lost your housing. Maybe, you had a great schedule to pick up your kids from school, and now that you're by yourself, you don't know how to pick up your kids and work a job and put food on the table. So there's a lot of vulnerability that can happen just logistically and emotionally in that time after you're leaving. And so that can be a time where you might be really eager to get into another relationship to get support, or you might be extra vulnerable. And so someone can identify that and kind of take advantage. So that can definitely happen where someone is trying to move away from the violence they're experiencing and might fall into another experience that has violence that is similar.
She said, what are the chances of death in these relationships?
So that is something that can happen and is part of why, again, it is so important to have this conversation, because the risk is not small. Lethality can happen. In terms of statistics, there's certain ones in DC or globally that I don't have off the top of my head, but we know that domestic violence can cause lethality in a number of different ways. We know that for pregnant women, domestic violence and homicide by an intimate partner is one of the leading causes of death. We know that there's a big overlap with gun violence, as well as things like strangulation can be extremely dangerous that you might not even realize in the moment. So domestic violence, when it escalates to that level, can be highly dangerous. And it's really important that people can get support and access to safe options before that becomes a reality.
Isn't there a psychological impact as well?
Yeah. What can you elaborate a little more?
I mean, I'm just wondering, because to your point that you made earlier, it's not just physical. And I'm thinking about the other term that you used, which was trauma informed, which we didn't get a chance to ask about. But I'm just kind of wondering what the psychological impact might be in people.
So we talk a lot in our trauma-informed care trainings about this. And so we know that experiencing any form of trauma can have huge impacts on our bodies and on our minds. When we talk about this in regards to trauma, we talk about a couple parts of the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. And we know that trauma can actually impact your brain. So with consistent exposure to trauma, your hippocampus, which is responsible for memory and really sequencing your memories, as well as your prefrontal cortex, which is what regulates your emotions and is the critical thinking, those can actually shrink in volume with consistent exposure to trauma. So we have those elements of the neuro science of how trauma impacts us, which domestic violence is a huge trauma. And then you have those emotional elements of cognitive responses and things like anxiety and depression, withdrawal. All of that is really common in survivors and people navigating these abusive relationships.
Thanks for clearing.
Thank you for bringing that biological basis of how trauma affects us, because it's real. And post-traumatic stress is real because of those physical changes as well.
Right.
I know we probably have some more questions from the audience, Lila and Wayne.
Yeah, I was going to ask, this may get complicated, so I think it's going to be a two-parter. Is there a way for someone who's witnessing abuse, is there a way for them to report it anonymously without having to go and speak with law enforcement? Likewise, for the victim themselves, is there a way to report it without having to show my face or their face and I'm not saying I'm being abused at all, but I'm just saying, is there a way to report that anonymously? Particularly in my head, I'm sort of thinking, particularly for someone who's sort of witnessing it happen to someone else.
Yeah, so this is a really, I think, important question a lot of us have. And before I, tell you how you might report, the really important response to this question is that we want to be survivor-centered here. And so we don't want to report without someone's consent. We want to connect with that survivor and see, what they want for support. And that, that can be really different and complex in different situations. Is it someone who's, a friend of yours, and you can take that space and check in and say, hey, how are you, and build that connection? Or is it someone who you're just seeing on the street and you might be witnessing that? So it can get complicated in terms of how you might respond. But we know that if we, step in and force someone to report or force someone to, go to the police before they are ready, or if they're not ready, not only is that in some way stripping their power and control in a different way, not only might putting them more in danger from systems. We talked about migrant communities who might be really hesitant and afraid to talk to law enforcement, or, people who've experienced police violence, the Black community, people might really not want that law enforcement. So there's that piece. And we know if the abuser finds out and retaliates and that survivor doesn't know that, it's getting reported, it can also increase violence in the relationship. So that's the kind of global picture on how we might do that. But in terms of, if there's a high danger situation and you do need to report, what we do recommend is, calling NPD or CFSA, Child Family Services, for that emergency support. If in that moment, you're witnessing a really highly dangerous, potentially lethal situation, those emergency services are where you can report. And the last note I'll make on this is, you can do your own learning and reflection of when I started as a caseworker, I didn't know how these processes work. So I just talked to an advocate and I was like, hey, what does it look like? How does this go? And if you can get some of that information yourself, that can help you support someone and be able to provide them with resources and support.
Okay. What if the abuser is like a public figure or someone that has a lot of, pull in the community? How would a person, maybe it's the same consideration, but I feel like that's a circumstance where people feel even more or less likely to report.
Right. Or somebody, even if it could be a pastor or a doctor or somebody who is accorded a lot of respect just because of their professional position.
Yeah, and that's such an important nuance that you bring up there. And we know that abusers can often be really charismatic, outside of their relationship. And it can be people who you wouldn't, quote unquote, wouldn't expect. So that's a really real element. And abusers often use that privilege to further isolate someone. And so I would just reinforce that idea of being survivor-centered and really supporting that survivor in their choices, but also add that, when they gain access to services, it doesn't necessarily mean reporting that person publicly. And so if someone feels more comfortable just getting support and say, getting a civil protective order, getting essentially a restraining order, or getting mental health counseling, you can get access to all of those resources without ever, quote unquote, reporting your abuser or going through a legal process, which I think can be freeing and also just essential for someone who might not feel ready to take that on.
That actually led right into my next question about resources for folks in it, and then resources for survivors. So what does that look like, Francesca? Like what do those resources look like?
Yeah. So again, I'm an expert, especially in the DC area, but most of these resources we talk about exist in other areas just through different organizations. But we have those different groups that I mentioned earlier where you have hotlines and chat lines. you have mental health and counseling support. So thinking of all that trauma and thinking of how to move through that, we can't do it alone. We need support. We have the legal service providers. So getting a protective order can be hugely helpful, but also, you know, maybe you're a migrant and you're eligible for a U visa, which could help you in your immigration process. And so if you can talk to a lawyer for, you know, with these free and confidential services, you can learn about avenues for support, as well as, you know, we have the culturally specific service providers and then the housing service providers that can really support with those people who are in need of housing and immediate support in that way.
So it is a specific question about those resources. As from Mulanesh Kasey, what are the resources that are specifically for individuals who are desensitized to domestic violence because of cultural aspects?
Yeah, so that's a really important note to bring up, is that we talk a lot about this in our trainings, that domestic violence is never normal, but can often be normalized in certain groups, whether that's, you know, a larger culture, whether that's the sports team you're on or your ethnic group or whatever group that is. So when thinking about that, as a survivor, sometimes accessing those culturally specific service providers can be really helpful. You know, if you hold an identity that you feel you might not be respected or responded to well, going to general service providers, finding a culturally specific service provider. And then I don't know exactly if this was where their question was going, but there are also some resources for people who might think that they are doing harm themselves. And so there's a new innovative hotline called A Call to Action that gets at that, as well as certain state-specific resources for people who might feel like they're engaging in those unhealthy behaviors, who might feel like they're being abusive. They can also gain access to support in learning how to, you know, be a healthy partner and to provide, you know, a safe environment.
Wow.
I'm glad that you mentioned that last one. And the other piece of the nuance about having a culturally specific provider is they can understand the nuances of your culture in terms of the way that people relate to each other and the ways that abuse can be showing up within the context of your culture that other people might not understand. So ethnic groups within the same you know, we might look at, you know, Irish people the same, but there's a difference between Northern and Southern Irish, and what are the nuances of the particular culture that we're talking about.
Yeah. So, and the last thing I'll add really quick on that is, under survivor-centered and trauma-informed care, every advocate is, you know, going to reflect the language and experience of that survivor. So we will all do that, and it's really for the survivor where their comfort lies. You know, are you more comfortable with a culturally specific? Are you more comfortable with a general service provider? But through survivor-centered advocacy, we're always going to reflect back and understand and work to understand what that survivor is telling us.
So I want to say this. I want to remind everyone that it is a ticker, is a scroll for the domestic violence hotline that's going on. It's an 800 number. But Paige Mays Rice asks, who does the 800 number contact?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when you call the hotline numbers, you'll be connected to a domestic violence advocate. So that's someone who's gone through the 40 hours of training on domestic violence and ethics and where to gain access to support and crisis intervention. So depending on the number you call, you know, it might be a national service provider or a local service provider, but it's someone who is trained and is survivor-centered and can listen. And then really their job will be to ask you what you need and help you connect with what you need. You know, it could be one of those services, but it also might be like, hey, I'm really struggling in a different way, and being able to get connected to whatever service and whatever support you need in that moment, that listening, that validating, and then that referral and connection.
Or helping you make a safety plan, right?
Or helping you make a safety plan, exactly, you know, in the moment.
Wow. Well, this has been just an amazing wealth of information, insight, understanding about survivor-centered services and care, not being judgmental. I mean, we've just covered a range. If you think that you might be an abuser, where how to reach out for help. We've just covered so many things. Francesca, thank you so much for just being a wealth of knowledge and a clear explainer of so many of these concepts. Karen, thank you so much for all that you do, for putting this wonderful show together and helping us find Francesca. Wayne and Lila, what can I say? Y'all make it happen. Love you, appreciate you. Be Health Empowered family. Thank you for the great questions and the comments. And of course, until I see you next time, remember, be wise, be well, and be health empowered. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.